Go.
Welcome all. On behalf of Institute of Reproductive Medicine, I like to welcome all the faculty and the delegates for the CME meeting on consent issues in OBS gynae subfertility and controversies in ART bill. I would like to call upon Dr. Kundavi ma'am, Head of the Department of IRM Triple M Chennai, to deliver the welcome address. She is a specialist in reproductive medicine and lab surgeon for more than 20 years. Uh, she is the joint treasurer of OXY and active member of OXY, FOXY, IMA, ISAR, and TAPISAR. Over to you, ma'am.
Thanks, Dr. Reshmi. Good afternoon, and on behalf of IRM, a warm welcome to all of faculty and the delegates for the first CME of this year, 2021. And the CME is going to be on a panel discussion on consent issues in obs-gynae fertility and the controversies in ART bill. And I'm sure the delegates are going to benefit from both the panels. And before we start our session, our heartfelt condolences to Dr. Shanta ma'am, who's the chairwoman of Adyar Cancer Institute, and let her soul rest in peace. And I welcome and I invite Dr. Tamil Chelvi to start the session.
Now I would like to call upon Dr. Tamil Selvi ma'am, consultant urogynecologist and pelvic floor surgeon from IRM. She has special interest in bladder pain syndrome and preventive oncology. She is also an examiner for Part 3 MRCOG exam. Over to you, ma'am, to introduce all the panelists and for the next panel discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Reshmi. At the outset, I would like to thank the IRM team for giving us this opportunity. And I do have a gamut of experts to help me with this panel discussion. I think you're seeing which slide are you seeing? Are you seeing the PPT on CV? Are you seeing the PPT on consent issues?
No, madam, now we are seeing CV. Kindly click on your slide and move. Yeah.
Okay. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Hepzibah Krivamani. She, as you can see, she is currently the professor of Obs and Gynae in Savita Medical College, but she has donned several hats. She is a former superintendent of RSRM Hospital, past president of Oxy Society, and the vice president, currently a vice president of Chennai Menopause Society. And if you look at the awards and the textbook she has written, you can understand she has a passion for teaching. So, and this is something which she carries, I think, until she's probably 90 or 100 even. And while we were all busy during the lockdown brewing Dalgona coffee, she's so young at heart, she managed to develop a medical app for Indian Menopause Society on midlife and beyond. So it's a pleasure to have you with us, madam. Dr. Pranati Reddy is a very well-known face from Hyderabad who is a part of all our medical endeavors. Now, Pranati is a clinical director of Birthright by Rainbow Group in Hyderabad. Over the years, I've known her. I've seen her always as an enthusiastic and optimistic person with a strong evidence-based voice, and her opinions are mostly evidence-based. And welcome, Dr. Pranati. Dr. Ravi Shankar, the person to whom doctors in distress turn to, is the go-to man, and he is the medico-legal expert for the whole of Tamil Nadu. And if you have not spoken to him, maybe you've been lucky so far. So, but he is one person you need to know. It's a good thing to know about him because he is always at the phone send for any advice which you want. And finally, our own young blood from our own institute, Dr. Abdul Basit, trained in reproductive medicine, both in Apollo hospitals in Chennai and in Singapore. And he will field the subfertility questions and also the obs and gynae questions for today. And with this, I move over to the panel discussion. Okay, are you now able to see my slide on consent issues?
Yes,
Yes, madam. Please continue.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank
Kindly
you.
change to presentation mode.
Yeah. Because we have a team of experts, I'm going to move this discussion as not as panel discussion, but as experts' opinion. So over to all the experts for their opinion on the several issues which we are going to discuss. We know the audience possibly will not be able to answer this question, but we would like to involve the audience in this first question. And I want you to think through this. You probably will not be answered to us, but I want you to think through this case scenario. A 42-year-old patient has come to the clinic with menorrhagia. You have taken a history and you're planning to do an abdominal and pelvic examination to assess the patient further. Do you take a consent prior to this examination? The same question is moving over to the panel. Now, can I start with Dr. Abdul, because you belong to a different gender in the gynecology and this is more pertinent to you. So do you take a consent prior to the examination, Dr. Abdul?
Yes,
and
ma'am.
if so, what type of consent is it?
So it would be a consent where I explain to the patient what I'm going to do and what information I plan to gather from the examination, both the abdominal as well as the speculum or the vaginal examination. It would be a implied verbal consent. So I would tell the patient that I'm going to do this. I'm going to gather this information from the examination. And if I do not do the examination, what are the things that I could likely miss? And what are the other things, other investigations that I could do to replace the examination as such? And that I would also imply that there would be a chaperone along with me so that the patient also feels comfortable. And once a patient gives a verbal consent, yes, okay, I would like to have the examination done, then I will go ahead with the examination.
Pranati?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable thing. I think basically we just have to tell them what we intend to do. And if this is called an implied consent or a verbal consent, once you explain to them, and if the patient then, goes into the examination room, undresses and lies on the couch, it means that she's willing to undergo the examination.
Thank you. But if can the patient accuse you of wrongdoing or battery or during examination? Hepsi, madam?
Yeah, especially when the male doctor is going to examine. In addition, he must have a female attender. So it's better he explains what are all the, as already mentioned, he has to mention what are all the information she will get it and whether it will be painful or painless. And based on that only, he can order the investigation. So he has to be very careful, especially a male doctor examining a female patient. He has to be extra careful. And verbal consent is always necessary to call it. If she is not expressive enough to go to the room and give consent, it's better if we can even take a written consent. If he is going to accuse that type of a character, it's better to take a written consent before we proceed.
Dr. Ravi Shankar, sir, what would be your take-home message for all of us, sir? Has Dr. Ravi Shankar joined us?
Yeah, I'm just outmuting. Thank you. I think everybody has given the practical outlook what they have experienced in the last 30, 40 years. This is what has to be done. Madam, with her experience, I've already said, it is going to come to a stage where even for doing a PV examination, they are going to get a written consent. That's a stage that is evolving slowly. But then the right of the doctor is also lost if that is going to happen. Then we need to be very safe. More than that, it is not going to be a chap who is accompanying a male doctor. It is going to be a female paramedical who has to be along with a male doctor to examine the patient as per the code of medical ethics. One. Number two, it will be ideal also to have an attender patient in the examination room, provided they have the understanding, and all you need is explain everything. I think everybody has told about this. I think this is what it has to be way, and it is slowly going to evolve that we will be forced to take a written consent even for a EVPR examination.
Okay. Now, cervical smear and outpatient endometrial biopsies, something which we commonly do in outpatient setting. This is both for the audience and the panel. I want you to tell me, do you take a verbal or a written consent for a cervical smear, or do you take a verbal or a written consent for endometrial biopsy? Pranati, Dr. Pranati?
So for a cervical smear, again, if you explain to the patient what you're doing and the purpose of the examination, you really don't require a written consent. A verbal consent is enough. But a Pipple endometrial biopsy there is a small but definite risk that it can sometimes cause complications, or we've seen cases where perforations have occurred. But if you're planning a Pipple endometrial biopsy, I think it's always useful to take a proper written consent for the endometrial biopsy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, madam.
Can I add?
Yes, madam.
Tamil?
Yes, madam. Please carry on.
It is simple vaginal smear for infection. I think it's a verbal consent is enough. If you're going to do a pap smear screening, your former consent form should be screened, because many a time they do not know whether it's a screening procedure, whether they will pay, all those things. So the screening is going to be a diagnostic. All the differentiations is not known to the patient. And suddenly somebody will come and blame you. If you're going to do a pap smear screening, you have to get a proper consent form and then do a pap smear. And of course, for Pipple curate also, we have to get a written consent explaining the benefit, the risk, and the problems. That is safe side.
Is that what happens in your
definitely we have to get a written consent.
Is that what happens in your setup, madam, for smear examination?
No, we have a standard written consent form, no? So they read, we are asking them to read, and then they give the consent, and then we do it.
The standard written consent form is for all outpatient procedures.
No. Outpatient, see, for urinary catheterization, IV and all, simple verbal consent is enough. See, pap smear, colposcope, Pipple curate, the specific thing should be mentioned in that consent form. Why we are doing it, what is the indication, what is the risk, what is the benefit, what is the outcome. Everything should be included in the form. The form should be complete. And we are supposed to sign on the patient, and the explaining doctor also should sign the form.
So at present, we are not taking a consent for pap smear.
No, it will come, madam. See, NABH and all, they are insisting all the small procedures also we have to get consent.
So that is something probably we all have to look at together, because we also don't get any consent for the PAPs, for the cervical smear. The Pipple endometrial biopsy, yes. So the take-home message is any invasive procedure is better to have a verbal as well as a written consent. Is that right, sir?
Even in verbal, Tamil, even if you verbal, if you are taking a consent for vaginal smear, for example, it's better to document in her outpatient procedure record, medical record, and get a, it's always safe to document in that outpatient procedure, records.
Dr. Ravi Shankar, sir, have you got anything to add on, sir?
No, everything has been perfect.
Thank you, sir.
Documentation that is going to defend you so better document that it has been explained and oral consent has been obtained. And when you are trying to, in all the consent, when you are going to get a signature of the patient and then the doctor who's doing the procedure, there has to be a witness in all the consent form, and that witness will have to be from the patient side.
Okay. Moving on to our second case. This is a 31-year-old lady with a chronic pelvic pain. On evaluation is found to have a endometriotic ovarian cyst of 8 centimeter in size, and she's posted for lap ovarian cystectomy with a CA 125 or 130. She has no comorbidities. Now, The questions are, who should take the consent? Dr. Abdul?
The consent should ideally be taken by the operating surgeon, but appropriately delegated to some other doctor also. It is okay if the assistant doctor to the surgeon takes the consent, or the operating surgeon takes the consent, but the person who is taking the consent should be properly trained to take the consent, explain properly the risks, the benefits, and what are the alternative options available to the patient, and then give time to the patient to go through and then get back to us with the consent, whether yes or no. So,
Dr. Pranati?
So this is an elective procedure.
Yes.
It's not an emergency procedure.
Yes.
So this is being discussed in the outpatient department, and the patient is being explained what is going to happen. So ideally, these consents have to be taken by the operating surgeon. And they have to be taken, I don't know, Tamil, whether, you know, I can, they have to be taken in the outpatient department setting where you're actually talking about the procedure to the patient. So you have to talk to them about the procedure, the complications, the intended benefits, and these have to be documented in your a formal consent form, like what you would take in the hospital settings. Your hospital consent form should be filled in the outpatient department. It should be explained to the patient with your signature dated on the day you have explained in the outpatient department, so that the patient can go home with this consent form. She has enough time to reflect upon this consent form. If required, she will even seek a second opinion on this. So that should be the ideal thing, not when she comes into the operating theater. I mean, for emergencies, that's acceptable, but for a planned elective procedure, consent has to be taken by the operating surgeon in the outpatient department. When the surgery is being planned, this should be documented, handed over to the patient, and she should be asked to bring the form into the hospital when she's coming and can sign in the presence of another doctor. That's all right, you know, as long as the operating doctor has explained and signed it in the outpatient department. When she comes into the hospital for admission purposes, at least at that point, once she has had the consent form with her for a while, she can come and sign in front of the admitting doctor, and the admitting doctor can come to sign it. This is what we follow.
Okay. Now, I'm going to stay with you, Pranati, for a minute, and then I'm going to move over to Professor Hepzibah. In India, there are different practices. Now, you and me probably are sitting in a corporate setup or in a hospital where we have the OPD and the theater in the same premises. There are a group of gynecologists who are sitting in clinics where they are probably attached, or they go admit patients in different nursing homes and hospitals. How can they simplify this problem? What would be your suggestion? Please,
you're asking me?
Yes, please, Pranati, and then we'll move over to Hepsi, madam.
Yeah, so they can have a standard operating consent form, and they can have the name of the admitting hospital. See, the only thing is with them, when they're sitting in the clinic, they need to decide which hospital this patient is going to. So they can have a form which, you know, which is the standard operative consent form of this, and they can have a form for the admitting hospital. This form can be explained and filled to the patient and signed, documented away. And when they get admitted into that hospital, the hospital can finish its formalities. You know, if they have a separate consent form, it's fine. They can take it. Their admitting doctor can take it, because obviously the hospital will have its own formalities. But it's mandatory that there should be this form which has been filled by the doctor, given to the patient, allow time for reflection, and then come in with that. And both these should be filled. So I think people who have their own clinics and are not sitting full time in a hospital, this is the practice they should adopt.
Thank you. Hepsi, madam?
Yeah. Yes, I agree with Dr. Pranati. Even in the clinic, they can have this consent form, because they have to explain it is a planned surgery. As she said, the patient has to think about it, and the necessary things they can sign on the same day. See, the day before or 2 days before, and the patient also can countersign. And when they enter the nursing home, there will be another consent form for admission and other things. The anesthetist also should talk to the patient, and the anesthetist also should sign about the risk of the anesthesia and the benefit what he is tend to choose, which type of anesthesia, all that the anesthetist also should document and sign in the consent form. So that should be the practice.
Thank you, madam.
So just
Ravi
because they
Shankar
are in the clinic, they doesn't mean they should not take the proper this thing. The surgeon should explain what are all the things she will be doing it, what is the risk, what is the concurrent thing. If sometime we may tend to do it. Apart from the planned procedure, some other things can crop up during the procedure. For that also, they should take a consent. And if the patient should give permission so that if there's some problem, unprecedented problem occurs, to go get the surgery. All that should be included in the consent form.
Okay. Ravi Shankar sir, is it important to have a witness, and who should be the witness? Can it be one of the hospital staff?
That's a common mistake we always do, because we learn 30, 40 years back from the government institutions where it is usually the sisters who do the signature. But a consent form with a witness signed by one of the operating team's member. Your paramedicals, the hospital staff are all the operating team. So it will become invalid. It has to be one of the relative of the patient who will have to put down the signature as a witness. If they are not able to get a relative to do the witness, you will have to find a person in the hospital and stand by them from another patient attendant, which is practically not possible. That's another issue. Finally, when they don't have anybody to put down the signature, it now boils down finally to the resident medical officer or the RM or the medical superintendent of the hospital with the general intention, with the general opinion that any doctor will try to do the best for the recovery of the patient. Only when there is no one to sign, which has to be documented in a sheet, that there is no one to sign as a witness, that we are utilizing the medical superintendent or the senior resident medical officer to do as a witness. Otherwise, a witness signed by a hospital employee, whoever it is, will become invalid in the court of law.
Okay, sir.
And most important for the previous thing, in your clinic and then coming to the depends that the concern should be signed and dated after the patient is admitted in the hospital. That's very important.
So the validity, is there a validity to the consent, sir? Is it not valid after 1 month or 1 week or 10 days? Is there any validity to the consent, sir?
Yes, madam. Yes, madam. It is not written in the law by anywhere. It has to be in 6 hours, 12 hours, or 1 day or whatever. But then if the surgery is being deferred for 2 days, I think within 2 days, certain things can change for the patient. In that situation, you need to take a concern. Probably we can think that a concern for a single day will be valid. And if the case is shifted to the next day, we need to take another concern. Otherwise, the concern will become invalid, madam.
Sir, what I was implying was, when the patient has done the consent in the OPD and is going to be admitted a week later for surgery. So in that case, do you have to actually repeat the whole process of consenting in the hospital, or can you just countersign when the patient comes there?
You can just countersign. The issue here is when he expresses a concern to undergo surgery under one person in this clinic, yes, he is willing to have it done by that particular obstetrician or gynecologist. But then he switches over to a hospital there. There is going to be a different infrastructure, availability, non-availability is there in that hospital. Vicariously, you are responsible for everything. But then when he goes to the hospital, definitely there is going to be another concern. It is not that admission signature is valid when they get admitted. There has to be, I think madam has already told, the anesthetist will have to explain. And here when you are trying to post for a laparoscopy, sometimes you may have to go in from a spinal to a general anesthesia. Or sometimes you may have to shift from laparoscope to the open method. All these things will have to be explained prior to taking the patient into the theater. I think every gynecologist will know about the case of Shamira Kohli versus Prabha Markandeya, where when inside the theater, they came and got a signature from the mother. All these things cannot happen nowadays because something worse precedence has happened, and we are supposed to learn from that bad experience and judgment in the court. I think a concern taken in the hospital is more valid because at that point of time, it involves the hospital infrastructure, the anesthetist, the post-operative care, and the gynecologist or the obstetrician who's operating. But when they express a concern in your clinic, it involves only the operating surgeon, and they are willing to consent to have the surgery under them. So this is two different. And so when the patient is admitted on a particular day in the hospital, I think the concern will have to be re-signed again in the hospital.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
Yes, Pranati.
yeah, no, sir, I agree with you, sir. What you're saying is absolutely correct. So, when I talk about consent in the OPD, I mean that the consent has been explained and written.
Yes.
The signature will be done by the patient when they come into the inpatient hospital only.
Yes, yes. The date and time is very important. That is why.
Yeah.
The time of admission in the hospital.
Okay.
That is all. That's all, madam. That's all, madam.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Now, we all have bilingual consent forms. But let's say if a patient is from Hyderabad and she knows only Telugu and she's come to us and we are going to take a consent. Can we use the interpreter, family member as an interpreter?
Yeah.
Is that Dr. Ravi Shankar, sir?
Yeah. You can use that interpreter who is a family member or anybody, but then he will have to sign in the form that he has explained to the patient in the language known to him. And I have been part of explaining the whole procedure, and he will have to sign it. That's very important. It becomes a witness also.
Okay. Hepsi, madam, anything to add on, madam?
Yes. As sir said, we have to have an interpreter, and it should be always, the concern should be in their own language. If somebody is able to write the concern in Telugu, it's better. We always get in government hospital in Tamil because they're able to read. If we get a Hindi patient, we have to have an interpreter, and the interpreter also should sign in the form in the presence of the patient, and the doctor who explained also should sign.
So my take-home message was supposed to imply, can the interpreter be a family member or does it have to be an independent person?
It can be a family member, but they have to.
It is better the
You'll have to see always is
and because
somebody
the family member
who
usually
knows Hindi but may sign in English.
Yeah.
Somebody who knows Hindi but keep some impression because he will not know to sign even in the Hindi. So all these things also will have to be entered. No Hindi, don't understand English but signing in English. That has to be there. No, I can understand Hindi, but I cannot sign in Hindi, so my thumb impression. Everything is becoming sub-speciality nowadays because we have to comply with the legal complaints of the Indian citizens.
So whatever is the language the patient understands, we need to explain that the patient has been explained in that local language, and the signature has been obtained in this language. So that has to be documented by us when we do the consent. Yeah, thank you, sir.
Yes.
So we've discussed validity of consent. Dr. Abdul, in this particular case, what are the components of the consent in this particular case? Can you just tell us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, please?
So the first would be to explain what the procedure is, what the procedure would entail, how the procedure is going to be done, and what are the intended benefits out of the procedure that the patient can get, and what are the most common, the frequent risks, what they are, and what are the serious risks. So these two should be concentrated, the frequent risks and the serious risks, and what are the alternative options that the patient has if they do not want to undergo the procedure. And sixth is any additional procedures that may be required for the patient. For example, in this case, we may need to open up the patient if you're not able to complete the surgery laparoscopically. Or if the patient, it turns out to be a CA, she may need later surgery. So all those risks also, all those components also must be discussed. Additional procedures during the surgery or during a later period. So all these things need to be discussed with the patient.
So your documentation, the discussion part of it is you've done it as oral. Documentation in the consent form will involve What are the components? The risk factors or just the risk or the benefit also?
Benefits you don't really have to document. The procedure explanation, the risks, and the additional procedures need to be documented.
Does anyone like to add on anything more to that?
When we talk of the indication why we are operating, probably that will anyway cover the benefits of the surgery, isn't it? So that's something that we'll have to document, why the surgery is being done.
Yeah. Anything else, Hepsi madam? Would you like to add on anything?
If the patient strongly feels, that she doesn't want certain things, I think it's important to ask her, preoperatively. We may not be able to cover everything, but if it is big and we may have to remove the ovary in this circumstances, what are her thoughts on that? Is in this particular case is something that we need to kind of look at.
So it is just not explaining the risk factors. So if you think that we might have to remove the ovaries for some reason, what is your understanding of that? How would you feel about that is a question you need to put forth. Is that correct, Dr. Pranati? That's what you were implying, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Right. So from those last two discussions, we understand that informed consent is not a piece of paper where we just sign. It's a process. It involves providing the relevant information and understanding what the patient understands of the information we have provided and ensuring that the patient has a decision-making capacity. And these three are basic rights of a patient which we cannot be tampered. And the informed consent is a ethical and a legal obligation of a doctor. Let's not just look at it as a legal obligation. It is also an ethical obligation. Moving on to the third case. Yes, sir. Ravi Shankar, sir.
Kundavi madam has added a question. What about taking photographs and recording the event of surgery? I think we need to get a consent prior to the surgery that you are going to record it for the medical purpose. A consent for taking a photograph and video recording the procedure will have to be taken prior to the surgery.
Yes, sir.
Am I correct, Madam Hepsi, madam?
Hepsi, madam, I think you are muted or we are not able to see you.
Yeah, it is very pertinent questions Dr. Kundavi has asked. Actually, any photograph, anything recorded, we have to get a consent before surgery that it is for scientific purpose. And she should give a consent for that. Otherwise, we cannot record. But at the same time, if she wants some recorded details for the procedure, that also we are supposed to give her for the record purpose. So that is very, very important. Without her consent, we cannot take photographs.
Thank you. Shall we move on to the third case? This is a 34-year-old primee, spontaneous labor, no problems during the antenatal period, a low-risk pregnancy. She presents at 5 centimeters cervical dilatation with rupture of membranes with vertex at -3 station, a normal CTG. She's contracting 3 in 10, lasting for 40 seconds. 4 hours later, on reassessment, she is basically cervix is only 1 centimeter dilated and vertex at -2 station, caput plus, molding plus, and right occipital posterior position. Patient is counseled about the lack of progress. Patient and husband do not wish to have any cesarean section and they would like to wait for another 4 hours, and they say, let's do another examination after 4 hours and let's wait and see. Contractions are quite strong and coming regular. Dr. Pranati, shall we start with you?
Yeah. So basically, once you've started this counseling process, I think it's very important that, so if I can go one step backwards, Tamil. So one of the things is, because pregnancy is a long journey that they undertake with us. And again, I'm talking maybe from the corporate standpoint where, we are seeing patients in private practice and it may differ from organization to organization. I think it's important that the patient should be aware right from, say, mid-pregnancy, 28 weeks onwards, when you're expecting them to, you must provide them with enough information about how this pregnancy is going to end. Because we all know that at the end of 9 months, she either has to have a normal delivery or an assisted vaginal delivery or a cesarean section. And this awareness should be there for the patient. right from mid-pregnancy onwards. We should give them enough information leaflets about it. We also should talk to them about the circumstances during the course of waiting for a normal delivery. What are the reasons why a patient may end up having an emergency cesarean section? Once you have a patient who's aware and who comes in, if you are in this situation where you as an obstetrician feel that there's lack of progress, and I think, the obstetrician has spoken to them about a cesarean section, because you've written that the patient and husband do not wish to have a cesarean section and would like to wait for another. So I think at this point, it is important to have a documentation of the counseling that you've done to them. That is, what is it that you feel at this point of time as an obstetrician? What do you think are the intended benefits at this point for taking up the patient for a cesarean section? And what would happen if they would wait for another 4 hours? And I think this has to be signed by the obstetrician, by the patient, and by her husband. It's not just consent for a procedure, particularly during labor. This is very, very important. I think a patient and attendant, they are bound to sign if they decline something also. It has been explained to me in the language that I understand that this is the intended benefit. However, I and my husband, having understood the benefits and the setbacks of this, have decided to wait for another 4 hours and see the outcome. And in between, if anything changes, obviously the doctor will explain that to us. It's very important to make the declining a procedure or declining a modality of action, which typically arises during the process of, childbirth, because labor is a process, it's not a procedure. So it spans over, 8 to 12 hours, and things evolve in that 8 to 12 hours. And if there is any difference of opinion at that point of time, and if something has been suggested and it's being declined, I think it's important both parties should sign.
Hepsi, madam, you work in a medical college setup. What would be your mode of action at this point, madam?
Yes, at this point, see, even before entering into labor ward, we should counsel them, as Praniti rightly said. We have to tell them it is a natural process which takes longer time, though it is physiological. They may end up in assisted vaginal delivery or operative delivery. So they have to understand. It may involve so many procedures. Even to put her on an NST, we have to inform her. And in some time when she may require an additional anesthesia, all that necessary information we should inform beforehand when they enter into the labor ward. So at this time, when we counsel them second time, it will be easier for them to understand and give consent. If they are not giving consent, the refusal thing for this intervention, we have to document, and both of them should sign. And we should explain to them, if it is not done that particular time, what will be the risk, what will be the outcome also should be mentioned when they sign. If they agree, then we have to wait. If they don't agree, if they agree, we can go ahead for the further interventions. Otherwise, we, as per the right of the patient, we have to wait. But it should be documented clearly, the refusal thing at that particular point. All that, when we take the patient for labor, it's better to include all the events and get the signature. And the long-term and the immediate side effects like infection, other things also we have to inform them when they enter the labor ward. It's better. Otherwise, they will blame us later on.
Ravi Shankar sir, question to you, sir. Now, both of them said, yes, we document, and then we actually get the patient and the attendant to sign it. Now, is it important that, will it make a difference that the patient or the attendant write it in their own language, in their own handwriting, that they are refusing this particular mode of treatment, and they understand the risks of it? Or does it not matter whether the doctor does it or the patient does it?
Very simple. It's always more valid when the patient does it, but when the patient is in labor pain, how can she write? In that situation, the next person is going to be the husband or the parents who are going to be there. But it has to be the husband. then there has to be another legal form which says this is the husband and that. All these things are going around. If you keep on talking with a lawyer, like half-baked lawyer like me, more troubles only will be there for you. But then in the same case sheet, continue writing. If the patient is not able to write, I think the doctor can write it and sign it, get the signature from the patient, definitely a witness. It has to be the husband. The husband is not there, the parents of the girl or somebody who are the in-laws, whoever it is. That has to be there. And this is a very, very particular question and problematic issue for every obstetrician, not only in this country, all over the world, when they refuse to do a cesarean section after being advised scientifically that this is it. Every point will have to be documented. Time has to be noted. Who does it has to be there. There are times in the court cases when the primary obstetrician leaves for another case, leaving an assistant to do the job, and they don't document properly. That is where the problem. A senior person, 50 plus, definitely would have encountered all the difficulties in undergoing a normal delivery for a patient. In that situation, they can anticipate all the problems, but then the junior people will not know it. That is where the issue comes. That is where the signature may be missed. And more important today, video recording has been, and that video recording, if it is possible, please be done it in a separate room, not in the labor room, not in the consulting room. It has to be a separate video recording chamber. It can be done in the regular consulting room.
Sir, your voice is breaking up, sir.
Video recording cannot be done in your consulting chamber or in your labor room. It has to be in a separate room, which has to be a video recording chamber. Concerned video recording chamber. Video recording will have more value. If the patient writes it, it has got a still more value. Otherwise, the doctor will have to sign it. Signature from the patient, from the attender as a witness. It has to be there. Timing. Every time you get the signature, the timing is very important.
Sir, is it okay for us to record the conversation which we are having with the patient on the attender when they refuse a treatment, either on the phone or with the either on the phone or the phone camera, probably audio, not video in a labor room, and audio documentation? Is it okay for us to do? Should we also get the consent of the couple when we do a audio documentation?
It is not a concern. It has to be informed that the entire conversation is audio recorded. You have the right to record it. But only thing is, when you're recording, you just have to inform, I am recording the conversation henceforth from this time onwards will have to be said, and then keep on recording. It is a defensive practice. It is the defense for your practice. That is why it can be done. All you need is inform the other person that it has been recorded.
Thank you so much, sir. Okay, now this question I'm not going to ask Pranati. This I like to ask Dr. Abdul. Do you take a consent for patients admitted for vaginal delivery? And also all the audience, I want you to think about it. Do you take a consent in patients getting admitted for vaginal delivery? And if you do so, do you mention all the complications which you can expect out of a vaginal delivery? That is an informed consent. Dr. Abdul?
We don't take a consent in a consent form, ma'am, but we do write it in the case sheet and then ask the patient to sign for the vaginal delivery. But we don't really inform about the complications mentioned because I'm not sure why we don't do it, but we don't do it. We only take write down that they've been admitted for the vaginal delivery and then they just sign it. That's all. We don't take a consent as such.
Hepsi, madam, what happens in the medical colleges, madam?
Yeah, nowadays we are having a consent form with all the risk. I mean, see, they may go for a instrumental delivery section, and if necessary, some augmentation. Everything is documented. Blood transfusion, another medication may be required, anesthesia may be required, and it's better to include about the baby also. She may get stuck with the shoulder dystocia, and we should explain this. We shouldn't scare the patient, but explain that, and it is included in the consent form nowadays. because even the postnatal complication like puerperal sepsis, emboli, all that is included. Blood transfusion, when we give blood transfusion in the labor ward, we get a separate consent form for blood transfusion, including everything, infection, and then prone for other diseases, and everything is documented. So it is better we get into the habit of having an informed consent, and we should counsel them in a way so that they agree that, okay, this is as Praniti said already, it is a process. It may end up in a proper outcome, but it may end up in a different outcome also. They should be mentally prepared so that they will sign. The way you explain, it is very, very important.
This consent form which I'm sharing with you is the consent form which Pranati has shared with me in the past. I think I'm not sure whether they're still using that. Dr.
Yeah.
Pranati, I know you've been using this for quite some time now. What is, and when you first sent it across to me, I was just looking at that and I thought this looks quite scary. If I had known all about this, I wouldn't even got married. That's the impression any woman would get. So what has been your experience, because you've been using it for a long time? Are there patients who are happy to sign this? Do they ask you a lot of questions? How do you manage?
Yeah. So this is exactly how a consent form looks. And I mean, a slightly shorter version of what you have put up over there. Yeah. So basically, see, like I said, one of the things over years, what we have realized as a group is that we have this advantage that we have of seeing patients for, at least 6 to 8 months, and we know only those who come in as an emergency or as a referral. We don't have this. So you build a relationship with the patient. So, and you tell them this even much in advance, by the time we actually encourage doctors to give this consent in the outpatients department itself, by the time they're reaching 32, 34 weeks, and this thing about when is my expected date of delivery, do you expect me to have a vaginal birth? That's when we start talking to them about it. And nobody really has declined to sign this consent form because of fear for the alternative is a cesarean section. I mean, ours doesn't look this big. I mean, it's a smaller version, but it does document everything, including laceration, fetal injuries, scalp injuries, and everything. Because I really think it's important for the patient to know. There's no point in, hiding these things that can happen. In fact, vaginal birth is the one which can actually, traumatize us as obstetricians and as patients also. They can have postpartum hemorrhage, babies can be born with Erb's palsy, and there's nobody who's read this consent till now and said that, oh, I'm so terrified that I'm going to undergo a cesarean section. People who are requesting elective cesarean sections are doing it for different reasons, the same reasons which all of us, commonly encountered. I'm scared of pain, or they want some muhurtam and things like that, but not because they're worried about signing this consent form. I think I really think as obstetricians, we establish a relationship with patients which is very different from other specialties. So, and we have the advantage of time, our ability to interact with them over a longer period of time. And they understand the spirit in which we are giving them these consent forms.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt, but 5 more minutes, please.
Just 5 more minutes. Okay, fine. Yeah. Dr. Abdul, this question is specifically for you. The couple are being investigated for subfertility. The husband is 26 years old and he's been advised semen analysis, and he is not comfortable providing it in the hospital and wants to do home collection, which is possibly a scenario for most of the IUIs also. Now, what is the practice in your hospital, and what process will you follow to safeguard yourself against any legal issue?
So some men do say that they are not comfortable providing the sample at the hospital, for which we generally say okay, but then they have to sign a statement stating that the semen sample that they provide is their own, and any analysis reports and offspring which comes as a result of using the sample for ART procedures belongs to them, and there will not be any paternity issues raised by either the patient himself or his wife in the future. So that is how we safeguard our institution when we take samples from home.
So you actually get them to document this, and is there a specific consent form for you to do this?
Yeah, we do have a home collection consent form for that. We ask them to sign that consent form, read the consent form and sign it, and then only provide the sample.
Okay. I think with this last question on sterilization, we will stop the discussion, Reshmi.
Yes,
there is a 32-year-old married woman who comes requesting sterilization along with a mother. Hepsi madam, do you need to take husband's consent in patients requesting sterilization?
No, as per the standard of sterilization, no need to get husband's signature. Only thing for family, other things, we get counsel them. But legally, patient has got every right to give consent on a own.
And do you inform and document the failure rate of the planned sterilization procedure?
In the consent form, they have the in the consent form, they have a failure rate, recanalization charge. It can recanalization, and if there is a development of ectopic, they get reimbursement also. All that is there.
Sir, Ravi Shankar sir, the patient undergoes sterilization after self-signing. The husband comes back and threatens it was done without his consent. Where does the gynecologist stand?
Code of Medical Ethics really says that the husband and wife consent is needed for sterilization. What practically happens the other way, because it is a national welfare program. That's a tough one to handle. I think going without a husband's signature is going to be a tough job to defend yourself in the court of law. The husband is going to be there. The Code of Medical Ethics clearly says it. Section, I forgot the section. Before that, I will post it in the chat box, the section which says that the husband's consent is necessary for a permanent sterilization procedure.
The guidance, what I was able to get, sir, it says the national guideline, which is from the Indian Health Ministry, says in 2014, only the consent of the acceptor, not that of the spouse. But the FOGSI ICOG recommendation, which came out in 2019, actually says that the signature of that of the spouse is preferable. So, and this is what it says, it's not mandatory, but desirable, so that the recent Supreme Court ruling is not violated. And the Supreme Court judgment was for any surgery which can affect the spouse's reproductive capacity. So sterilization comes under that gamut. So the actual consent form which is provided by the FOGSI for sterilization has got several components, and nowhere is there a question of where the husband can sign. So it looks like the husband's signature is preferable but not mandatory. Is that correct, sir?
Absolutely correct, madam. But when you go to the court, it is very difficult to defend yourself. It is going to be a tough proportion to take this case forward, because it's a marriage, it's a contract between two people. Legally, it comes that way. And when there is a contract between two people, it's a cultural one in our country. Almost everywhere internationally, it is a cultural one. But when something happens, will the woman accept the man to be sterilized without her consent? Will a wife accept the truth that the husband has been sterilized without her consent?
So the sterilization is consent for both the partners, sir.
Yes, it's a contract. It's a contract of marriage between two people. And if there is going to be a physical change which results in permanent disability of certain procedures or product in a human system, this is over the time. I think if cases are going to come, it is going to give a guideline later. Then FOGSI and your association has already come to the stage of preferably. So when you come to the stage of preferably, it will become a must over the course of time. Just to be very, very careful. These are things in the family life of a woman when she is separated from that person. She may come with her mother. And these are the situations where it has to be handled very difficult to handle. This guy may come back later after 5 years and demand all the problems. The same thing happened in Samira Koni's case. That's not a married person. 40 plus woman. She's not married to that army officer. He comes back, files a case, and get a case in favor of him, a judgment. These are contract. Marriage is also a contract legally, and then we have to be very careful handling the situation. I'm just, as a typical lawyer, trying to give the bad elements in the whole issue.
Yes, sir. There are a few points which I wanted Hepsi Madam's and Dr. Pranathi's views on. There is a checklist for operating surgeons before a sterilization. Is this being followed in either of your hospitals?
This checklist we are not following. Consent we are.
Hepsi Madam?
No.
Okay, because that appears to be an important thing in the FOGSI guideline as well as in the Ministry of Health. So, and then a few
Ministry
things.
of Health.
Sorry, madam?
Yes, it is followed. Even in government hospital, in the BCO hospital, they are following it. Checklist, they will check it.
Okay. And as far as sir was talking about marriage being an important aspect of all the consent forms, but
what should we do now?
What should we do now? Should we take preferably?
At the present juncture, whether to get husband's signature.
Preferable to take the consent of the husband is what Dr. Ravi Shankar says.
That says. Okay.
So, and these are the points which Dr. Hepsi Madam was saying. So the health facility will not be held responsible by me or by my relatives or any other person whatsoever if there is a failure of the operation is incorporated. So that is important for the patient to understand, and that needs to be done. And also in case of complications or if there is a failure and if the patient presents, the concerned doctor can do an MTP free of cost. And if they ask for any compensation, the government of India has got an insurance scheme and they have designated an amount, and only that amount will be paid and not more than that. Is that true, Dr. Ravi Shankar, sir?
Yes, madam, absolutely. But only thing, your center should be authorized by your local authority that it is a family planning center. That is the only criteria there.
Okay. And they cannot claim for the welfare of the child which is born as a result of the failure of a sterilization. So these are important aspects which all gynecologists should be aware of. So if someone is going to come and sue you saying it has failed, so I'm going to sue you, you have a very good defense mechanism already set by the government of India. I think in the interest of time, we'll stop there. Thank you, everyone. I think it was a very good take-home test which we have actually done. And I'm very thankful to all my panelists for keeping it live and interactive. Thank you, Ravi Shankar sir. Thank you, Hepsi Madam. Thank you, Pranathi. And thank you, Dr. Abdul. Over to you, Reshmi.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you all. So it was a real brainstorming session. So now moving on to the next session, I would like Dr. Abdul to introduce Dr. Hitesh Bhatt sir, our moderator for the next sessions for the controversies in the ART bill. Over to you, Dr. Abdul.
We welcome Dr. Hitesh Bhatt. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Abdul, we can.
Yeah, he's at present practicing at Andheri, Mumbai. He's a medical legal consultant since last 20 years. He's a honorary medical legal consultant at Wadia Maternity Hospital, Mumbai. Partner in legal firm BNS Medical Legal Consultancies. He's a past chairperson for Ethics and Medical Legal Committee FOGSI between 2014 and 16. He has authored many books, invited as national faculty at many national and state conferences, delivered more than 500 talks, and a consultant in medical legal aspects for about 50 hospitals across India. He served as an office bearer for IMA, AMC, MOGS, and AFG, life member of Film Writers Association, Mumbai. Welcome, sir.
So
I would also introduce the panelist.
All right.
we have Dr. Mridabashini Govindarajan, who is the Clinical Director of Women's Center, Coimbatore. She's an invited speaker at national and international conferences. She's received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Tamil Nadu Dr. MGR Medical University. She's received the Lifetime Achievement Award from COGS and IMA Coimbatore, author of several publications. She's an Inspiring Gynecologist of India in 2018 from Times Group. And she's also got the ISAR Lifetime Achievement Award in 2020. Welcome, madam. We welcome Dr. Madhuri Patel, who is the clinical director of Dr. Patel's Fertility and Endoscopy Clinic, Bangalore. She was the editor-in-chief of JHRS between 2013 and 2020. She's the associate editor of the Onco Fertility Journal, founder chairperson of the Karnataka chapter of ISAR. She is a member of International Reproductive Medicine Research Groups, written several chapters, edited several books, and has several publications in national and international journals. Welcome, madam. We have Dr. Gopinath, who is a director and senior consultant at the Institute of OB and IVF, SRM Institute of Medical Sciences, Chennai. He is a president of Fertility Preservation Society of India, member of the International Fertility Preservation Society, founder secretary of IFS Tamil Nadu chapter. He was a former professor of ONG at Madras Medical College. He is a past president of OXY and awarded the Icon of the Year in IVF South India 2019. We also have Dr. Priya Kannan, who is the Director of Clinical Embryology at Garbha Rakshambigai Fertility Center, who was a past president of ACE India and has authored many chapters in many books. Welcome, madam. Welcome all of you, and we would ask Dr. Hitesh to start the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdul, for a very nice introduction, and welcome all the panelists. I would like to share my presentation for today's panel. Just a minute, I'm not able to share. Okay. Yes. So, can you all able to see this? Yeah, you can see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, not taking more time, I would like to straight go to the questions. And the questions are based on your experience and your inputs for the bill, which is going to come for the ART practice. So let us first discuss what is bill and what is an act. Can any one of you tell what is the bill and what is an act? What is the difference between these two? Anyone can take the question.
Can we make a guess or something like that?
No, I think act is wherein it's just like a guidelines which is there, whereas a bill is when it has passed through the lower house well as the upper house, and then it has been signed by the president, and then it becomes a bill.
So the bill is a proposal by any member of the parliament, and that is the first step to become an act. When it passes from both the houses of the parliament and the president signs it, it becomes an act. So act is the law, it is the statute. Everybody should follow the act. And it is said that once an act is passed and gazetted, it is presumed that every citizen of India knows about it. Ignorance of law is never a defense. You can't say I don't know. So the act is the fine product. Bill is just an initiation to make the act. All are clear? So act is the bill is an engagement, act is a marriage. That is the difference. So this is just to know what we are discussing. So what we are discussing today is the provision in the bills. Actually, you cannot challenge the bill. You can challenge the act. Bill is just a process in the parliament. But we are still discussing the bill because we can give good suggestions to the parliamentarian so that the fine product will come good. So in ART, many bills were drafted. The first, they drafted the guidelines in 2005. Then they made it into bill, and the bill was introduced into the parliament so many times to make it into act in 2008, 2010, 2015, 2017, 2019, 2020. Any of this time, it could not be passed for one or the other reason. So it has still remained into the stage of bill. It has not made into the act. But what we are discussing today is 2020 bill. What all are things are there in the bill, and what type of act you actually want. Unless you know the provisions in the latest bill, you will not be able to suggest the government that what you want. And if you don't suggest, nobody is going to give you. It is said that you have to demand, then only the change will come. We are seeing the farmers, they are doing this all entire problem from the bill stage, though it has made into the act, but it is from the bill stage they have started agitating. Then only they can bring in the change. Once the act is made, it is very difficult to change it, just like PNDT. Now, the first question to all of you, and I want all of you, your views, is there a need for law on ART or for the subject of medical professional domain? Do we need law for everything? No. Does a professional need law? So I want, Sir Gopinath sir, I want your opinion in this. Do we really need a law for this?
Yeah, this is a very good question. If you take, for example, any other profession, they don't have a law controlling it. They don't have a law on engineering to say that this is how we have to build it and this is a violation of the law. And if you take even the other professions, there is no law. But here, the major issue on ART is because of the mushrooming and a lot of issues coming out of it, they wanted to regulate it, and that is how they've just come for it. But by and large, if you say a medical profession or a medical domain, I don't think there is a necessity to enforce law into it.
Basically, because ART deals with third-party reproduction, wherein you have the donors and you have a surrogate. So this has an agreement between the commissioning couple and the donor as well as the surrogate. And this has medico-legal implications. And probably that is why a law may be required.
Madam, by that logic, even the contractor and the builder has a contract. The engineer and the person who is building the house has a contract in between them. So every contract, and there is an engineer or legal implication to it, but they don't have a law for that.
Can I say?
Yes, yes, madam.
I think it is in the sort of crossroads of ethics and a lot of societal norms, and when ART is very different from a lot of other things in that way. So I think when you consider all of these things, there becomes a necessity for for a law in ART particularly, not for all of medicine maybe, but for ART particularly, because there is a lot of other intersections which are there, and I think it becomes sort of. But there cannot be a universal law for the entire world, and I think it has to be reflective of the local culture and local norms. I think so. It is necessary that every country makes its own law. But that's got to be, again, it cannot be made by totally non-medical people. It's got to be, again, a law made in consultation with medical, non-medical, governmental, whatever you have.
I think moreover, because we're dealing with gametes, and I think that is why a law might be necessary, because it will have an implication on inheritance, and it would have several other implications because of the genetic material what we are dealing with, and probably that could be one of the reasons for implementing.
The thing is, everybody has pointed out that law is required, so then the law will come. The first thing is whether we require law or not. If we oppose, then law cannot come, but if you require a law, then law will come. The problem here is in India, especially when they start making the law, instead of making the rules for the infrastructure and licensing, they start entering into the medical domain. They have started giving the indications on what indications you will do this, how you will do this, how many embryos you will put. So all these things will start coming in, and that will create a problem, they don't know where to stop, and we also don't know how far we want to get regulated, and that is where the problem is. Like MTP Act is very clear. They have talked about only infrastructure and gross indications, but there is no mention how to do MTP, what section you have to keep, how much material you have to take out in 6 weeks, in 8 weeks, in 10 weeks, when to give medicine. So here, and one more thing is, as sir has rightly pointed out, there is mushrooming of the ART centers. When you do not regulate yourself, someone else will. That is the law, and that is why we are facing this bill. Now let us start with the definitions in the bill. The bill says, commissioning couple means an infertile married couple who approaches an assisted reproductive technology clinic or bank for obtaining services authorized of the said clinic or bank. That means only the married couple will have right to take the treatment. How far this is logical, and what is your opinion on this? Do you think the unmarried couples or live-in couples should also be included as far as the treatment is concerned? I want opinion of all. We'll start with Priya first, because she did not speak in the previous question. Priya?
As I think I think the law must include how we should go about for the unmarried couples who are living together, because there was a court ruling saying that unmarried couples, the live-in couples also do have their own rights. So I think we must include them. We should be able to include them as well. And there are lots of cases who come for single mothers who wants to have a child, and that also I think is a situation that we must be able to address and help them out. But in terms of a single man, there has been lots of instances and examples of what has happened. I mean, having children through ART, I think that is another issue. I think we must be able to offer something to them as well. I think I feel it is not correct just to include only the married couple. We must be able to help out people who wish to have a child as well, within the boundaries of whatever is there in the adoption law and other inheritance law, and in accordance with all that stuff.
Yes. Any other panelists?
The important aspect here, why they offered for only married couples, is in the interest of the well-being of the unborn child. That unborn child is going to be taken care by the married couple. For example, if it is a living together, what is the agreement? How long they are going to live? Who is going to take care of it in future is a question. So if that issue is solved, probably you can extend it to the living couples. Or once when you just start giving it to the living couple, automatically the next question will come for a single woman. So it goes on extending. So there is a basic for giving it to only married couple. So we just have to make sure that interest is secured when extending it to the other indications.
Sir, I would like to make one point here, that what if they conceive naturally? All unmarried living couple do not require infertility treatment. They do conceive naturally, and there is no restriction on conceiving when they conceive when they are unmarried. So why there is a difference in giving treatment? Because only out of total unmarried couples, only 10% will require infertility treatment. 90% will conceive automatically.
Spontaneous. Even in marriages, sir, there's an option of divorce as well. So the marriage is not permanent. So nothing is permanent, sir. In that
so
case,
why they are making marriage compulsory?
There is a law to take care of the child. There is definitely a law.
So, Madam Mrudubhashini, any comment from your side?
The point Dr. PMG was making was the benefit of the unborn child. You know, if you think that the unborn child will have capable people looking after that child, then that's a different issue, but it's very difficult to define whether it's economic.
And what happens, see, when the MTP Act was made, they never wanted to promote the sexual promiscuity, and they put the word that barrier contraceptive for the use of married women, now the married couple. Now, when they use that word, now today, an unmarried girl is not supposed to use the condom, and if it fails, she is not supposed to get termination of pregnancy under that clause. Luckily, we have another clause which allows us to do termination of pregnancy for that girl. But otherwise, It is not allowed. So at that time, what they made is not really helping today's generation. And law should look forward, not the backward. And I don't think now many marriages will happen in future. We are going towards Western world. So I think
yeah, what I feel is now the live-in relationship is more common because nobody wants to remain committed. So I think they should be allowed to undergo ART treatment because if you go to see, I mean, the marriages are really decreasing. And somewhere it was mentioned, I think the woman, single woman can be treated, but then when it comes to a male, they have not mentioned anything about treatment of the male in the entire.
Yes. Also. So I'm coming to that also. Now the provision of the 2010 bill, it mentioned couple means relationship between a man above the age of 21 and women above the age of 18 years who are married or are in live-in relationship. In 2010 was more progressive and forward as compared to 2020, and that is the sad part in the bill. And they have also included women. Women can take the treatment. Woman means any woman above the legal age of marriage who approaches the ART clinic or bank for obtaining authorized services from the clinic and bank. What about man? Man is not included. That is only the reason is man will have to go for surrogacy, while women can take her own treatment. That is the only logic I can see. But this is what it is, and it is injustice to man as far as the bill is concerned. So that about the definition. Now we are coming to the registration part. The registration, there will be a state board, there will be national board. Do you think there is a need for separate registration than a nursing home registration or registration under Clinical Establishment Act?
So there has to be a single channel for registration that has to be transparent. And then see, it's something like an adoption registry. Anybody who just goes through that registration within that stipulated time has to be given a proper reply and then registered. For example, if you take our state board, we have been after them for more than 1 year to just get the registration. If you take the ICMR registration, it goes on and on and on. And after 2.5 years, finally, at one particular point of time, we just got it. By the time I moved to another ART center. So again, I just have to apply it and do that. I think there has to be a single channel for registration.
Actually, in this bill which is being discussed, that the provision which says for registration is like you submit the thing of your application to the state board, they are supposed to give you an answer within I think 45 days or something.
30 days.
And within which 30 days they have to give you an answer. So they are liable to give an answer and we can go ahead. But then I don't know how much it will work.
Priya,
actually,
the question
in Tamil Nadu, we've been already started.
The question is not
In Tamil Nadu, under PCP and DT.
The question is
so
not.
I don't know who's.
No, it is.
No, I mean, the question is not how fast they will give registration. The question is, do we need multiple registration for the same thing? What we are doing is medical practice.
Yes.
When I drive a car, I am given a driving license. I don't have license for Maruti. I don't have license for Toyota. I don't have license for BMW. It is the same license. I can drive any car. So with the same license of medical practice and a license for the place, I should be able to do any practice I want. Just I have to add that how many things I want to do. I want to do sonography. I want to do eye infertility. I want to do medical practice. What all you want to do, just mention in there. Why there is a need for so many registrations from different departments?
This is like PCPNDT because PCPNDT Act came basically because of a lot of sex determinations which were happening.
Exactly.
And in ART also we can have sex determinations that can be done. We can have sperm selection. And probably, therefore, they want a separate registration for an ART clinic.
Even for PNDT, I say you just mention in your nursing home certificate that you do PNDT procedures also. You are doing ART practice also. And no, they can keep a watch.
We have a separate registration now for PCPNDT.
That is what. Why there is a need? That is what I'm telling. See, more number of registration, more are the chances to have some bribery or something will open up. More license Raj will come. And more you are facing problems. with different officers. Today, PNDT inspection will come. Next day, ART inspection will come. Third day, nursing home registration will come. We are always busy in one thing only.
Yeah, ideally it should not be there, but then
we are going towards a single window. Like when I went to bank this time, they opened my single account, single form, and the 3 different accounts they opened: the trading account, the commercial account, that is the current account, savings account, trading account, and the locker. So from the one form, you can get multiple things. So why can't we have this type of system in the medicine? We have never thought about this. We have never demanded this, and that is why we are facing so many licenses for one single place and one single practice. So this is also a thing which should concern us, and we have to ask for single window. And they may have different departments, but they will give only one registration with everything mentioned. Like in driving license also, you will have 2-wheeler, 4-wheeler, heavy vehicle, everything is mentioned in one license. You are only having one license, and you have to apply at one place only. So that should be the actual thing. That is what I think. Now let us talk about provisions. It says that the clinic shall apply the assisted reproductive technology service to a woman above the legal age of marriage, that is 18 years, and below the age of 50 years, to a man above the legal age of marriage and below the age of 55 years. Any discussion on this or any doubt about this? Gopinath sir.
When it is above 50, I mean, when it is closer to 50s, you have to consider what are the risks. I mean, generally, when they come for an ART at 49, we have our own restrictions. And by law, they might just come and just ask you. I think it's a bit of a wide range.
I think for a woman, it should be 45, and for a male, it should be 50. I mean, because if a woman comes at 50 and she conceives at that point of time, so we really do not know how long she would be able to take care of the child. So, because here they have added the total age, I think, should be 105. That's what they say.
Yes. So it is for the late marriages also they have considered now, and I think that is why the provision. You can have the boundaries within this. You can treat up to 50 years if you want to, or up to 45 years for a female if you want to. But the legal boundary is this, and there was no legal boundary in the previous bill of 2010. And that is why people used to make 70-year-old, 80-year-old women parent, and that was not correct. And that is why this has come. Now, ART Bank. They say Assisted Reproductive Technology Bank means an organization that is set up to supply sperm, semen, oocyte or oocyte donor to ART clinic. Now the question is it all right if ART Bank retrieves gametes? Because they have to supply even the oocytes and sperms. What about the freezing? What about transport?
Yeah, basically,
is it a good step? Is it a good step, or
no,
they should allow?
No, I don't think it's a good step, because they'll have to have a clinician, they'll have to have an embryologist, they'll have to have an operation theater for the pickups, they'll have to set up an embryology lab. So this is going to increase the cost to the patient. Moreover, supplying this frozen oocytes to whichever clinic is wanted. Again, the transport might reduce the efficacy and the quality of the oocytes, and therefore the outcome of ART may not be as good as it's going to be if a donor is sent to a ART clinic, wherein the ART clinic stimulates as well as retrieves the oocytes and does the procedure then and there.
So this is what they have proposed. They have also proposed to give oocyte donors to the assisted reproductive clinic. They can send you donor as well, but they have also said the sperm, semen and oocyte, they can supply that. So, and as far as the cost is concerned, madam, if the patient is paying there, they will not pay you. That is the only difference. For patient, it is not going to increase the cost of the oocyte or semen, whatever is. Sir, what is your opinion? Gopinath sir, and then I'll come to Madam Mridubhashini and then.
Restricted in selecting the donors, right? See, when you are running an ART clinic, when you have to do, we have so many strategies, so many screening points with which we just do it, and it is done under your own guidance. So here, if it is going to be from a bank where you just have to get it, you have absolutely no control over it. That is number
But
one.
sir, they have to follow, and they are also under the ambit of the law. This bank will be made under ambit of the law. If they are infringing any, the responsibility is theirs.
No, it comes under the ambit of a law. But how is your selection? How is your matching? How is your screening? All that is, when we do it in our place, under our nose, it is going to be something different from what you just buy there. That is number one. Number two, as Dr. Madhuri mentioned it, a bank means not just getting an egg and just putting it there in the freezer. They also have to run an entire IVF unit there.
Yes, so it will be a clinic, one clinic converted into bank. That only will be the solution. So they are taking all the headache. It is like the,
I won't be very comfortable in that.
okay. What about Priya? What is your opinion?
I see what I feel is, though we are not very comfortable with them doing the selection of the donors, even if that is fine, they have done that. In regard to the technicality of oocyte freezing, as of now, we know that it is not as good in most of the people's embryologist hands. So in that case, by the technicality itself, just freezing the oocytes is not the most optimal what we can offer to the patient. So it's going to be affecting the results for the patients rather than having the donor, the oocyte donor come to the clinic and we retrieve the oocytes, and then rather than not freezing the oocytes, freeze the embryos, we would always prefer to freeze the embryos. So I think the technicality of oocyte freezing is perfected. It will affect it is not in the best benefit of the patient.
But Priya, in that case, the people will not prefer that ART bank and they will go to another who supplies better gametes.
And
there will be a competition.
Yeah, one question, Hitesh. Yeah. In the bill, it also says there is no compensation for the donor.
Sir, no, sir, not at present.
Oocyte.
No, sir.
They have not mentioned that in
only about
in the bill which they have proposed. That is for surrogacy, not for the donors. We will take that question. The thing is, when RMP used to make mixtures in their clinic and give it to the patient, and then when pharmaceuticals came in, they also felt the same, that the mixtures will not be as good as we are making ourselves. But now we're all prescribing medicines from outside, from the pharmaceuticals. I think if this will come, it will become habit of any doctor taking the gametes ready-made rather than stimulating the donor and doing the thing.
I think
I don't know, but this is the provision.
Can I just make one point?
Yes, madam.
Okay,
Yes.
Male gamete is different from female gamete, and I think sperm banks most people cannot complain about because it does not involve an invasive procedure. But when you're talking about female gametes, it involves a specialized medical procedure. And most of these banks, as they stand now, they're not defining who should run it and what kind of training they should have had. And it becomes very difficult for a standalone ART bank within courts. It will have to be, as you said, it will have to be another licensed ART clinic, which is then part of it. But you know, you really cannot have it run with a non-medical person and
absolutely no.
To come in and do
Absolutely
that because
no.
The problems that can arise are enormous.
The bank, when the bank will supply gametes, it will have to follow all the norms or all the medical norms as well. They must have some ART specialist as a consultant, and they will run the show. So this is what is the provision. I just wanted to ignite some discussion here. There is now about the age of the donor. They say the bank shall obtain semen from the males between 21 years of the age and 55 years of the age, and oocyte from a female between 23 years of age and 35 years of age. Is there any problem with this, or this is okay?
A male, it should not be 55. It should be less.
So that you can see.
I agree with that.
If it gets converted into act, you can always put your boundaries less than the law says. You cannot go beyond the law says. So law is if it is giving you a wide range, it is good in a way.
No, but then we will not have any control now, because we are going to get the donor sample from a ART bank. So how would we know that what age?
You will get the profile of the donor. in
Yeah,
Form
but
M, and that
then
profile
how-
will contain the age of the patient, the cup donor as well. You refuse. You have right to refuse.
But how authentic it will be?
Why are we putting a limit for the female age? For the very
Because
same reason.
when they say when we are treating a male of couple of up to 55 years, the age of male is 55 years up for the treatment. They will give you the same semen, matching semen, and that is why they have made this age. Because the age of treatment is this.
35 for women and 55 for men. Okay.
Yes.
Now, no. Scientifically, we know that after the age of 35, the male gametes can become abnormal as well.
Yes.
You know, there are congenital anomalies. So when it's a known medical knowledge today that the DNA fragmentation is higher beyond a certain age and problems can come from an aged male as well, why are we allowing that? So I don't think 55.
So when law allows you to go up to 55, you can restrict yourself. You can say ART Bank that don't send me any sample beyond 45.
You can say the same thing for the woman too.
That is what I'm telling. No, I'm telling that you can always tell the ART Bank that don't supply me semen beyond 45 years. I want up to 45 years.
No, I think if a gamete has higher tendency to be abnormal and giving rise to chromosomally abnormal babies, I think it should be the same for both sexes.
So, but as far as it is beyond what you want, there is no need to give any suggestion to the government on this point. That is what I'm telling. Because what we are gathering now is the points which we should write to the government that this is all we want. If they are giving more than what you want, then there is no need to give any suggestion. We have to give suggestions only when something is lacking or something is less than what we want.
No, I think it's inappropriate to give it between 45 and 55 for men.
Yeah.
Okay. So we can give this as a suggestion, right? Now, an oocyte donor, the second provision is oocyte donor shall be an ever married woman having at least one live child of her own with a minimum age of 3 years to donate oocyte only once in her lifetime and not more than 7 oocytes. So, ever married? Any question on this? Any doubt on this? No. Any suggestion on this? Ever married? Is it okay? If
what
the donor is married only and unmarried girl cannot become oocyte donor. That is the exact meaning of this.
The word ever means
an unmarried girl. The unmarried girl cannot become oocyte donor. That is what is the provision in the law. Is it okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
But ever married, then you can just say married woman. What does the word ever imply? I'm not sure about it. That's why I'm asking.
Ever married means
she's
married
and then she's divorced. So again she becomes
that is ever married.
So therefore,
at least married in her lifetime. That is what.
Ever married is like
having at least one live child of her own. This is another condition they have put. Is it a proper condition or this should not be the condition?
It should be.
At present,
the fertility is proven.
Proven fertility.
What if she has aborted? Why live child? What if she has undergone MTP?
Yeah, but then there could be an abnormality in the baby. We don't know. So live child probably will tell us that the oocytes are competent enough for being donated.
Okay. So this is the second condition they have put. It was not there in 2010 bill. In 2010, the only age 21 to 35, any girl between that was able to give oocytes. But now they have put restrictions. First is married. Second is at least one child of 3 years. Then minimum, the child's age is 3 years. That also they have put. What if the child is 1 year old? What if the child is 6 months old? They have not allowed this type of donors. Once in her lifetime. Any doubt on this?
It is very difficult to prove.
Very difficult to get donors.
Very difficult to prove.
What? Prove what?
You know, she is giving it only once. You know, because they always come to us, the donor oocytes, when we have been doing it, they'll always come to us saying that this is the first time they're just giving. Where is the proof?
So they are going to make a national registry wherein you will find the name. And in Indore, they've already started. There is a registry from the government. So you put the Aadhaar card of the donor and you will get how many times she has donated where.
No, that means there is going to be a shortage of gametes.
So what should be suggested here?
I think 3 times she can donate. I think.
Because in the 2010 guideline, it was 6 times with the gap of 3 months between each donation.
No, at least ideally 3 times with a gap of 3 months, we can just give it.
Okay, so this is what is the law, and we have to fight this. We just start making the suggestions, and we can give it to the government. Then not more than 7 oocytes shall be retrieved.
Yeah,
How
this
far
So
is
what do you
logical?
do for the rest?
Yeah, so what can we do? What should be done? Do we leave it so the patient can have hyperstimulation? She can have anything.
But why you are giving the the more stimulation? That is what they want to restrict.
No, so even if you're giving minimal, we cannot because each person has a different threshold for the oocytes to respond.
The same patient may
But
respond better in
we
the
cannot order them. We cannot order the number of oocytes that we're going to be getting. We can give the same medicine to 10 different people.
So what should be there is there should be with minimum stimulation. Those words should be there. They can put the dose of the drug. Only give this much dosage of the drug. That they can write, but not the 7 oocytes. That
So how can we give only this much dose here? Because if sometimes the patient doesn't respond to whatever you're giving your minimal dose. So we have to increase the dose.
Then
So,
don't select her as a donor.
But we
If he is
because
not
if her
responding
AMH,
normally.
no, if
If
her
he-
AMH and antral follicle count is normal on D2, then you anyway start. But sometimes these patients have FSH and LH receptor polymorphism. They have several other problems, and therefore they don't respond to that particular drug.
By
So
going through your
you
points,
can put the higher dose.
no, but Hitesh.
So you can put the higher dose as a minimum dose. Yes.
No, Hitesh, there, going through your points 1, 2, 3, I'm going to have a very, very small number of donors. Where is the
Yes,
question of me selecting it?
Sir, so that is why, see, that this is all are the provisions. And if this will become the law, there will be a problem. No, but this is the law. And that is why I'm putting it in black and white so that everybody will get enlightened and can suggest government to make some change.
Correct.
So can we put here them? You write maximum dose at 300 microgram, 350, whatever is your dose, but you put limit on the dose rather than on the oocyte. That is what is my suggestion as a legal person. I am not ART specialist, but I am a gynecologist. So at least I can say that there has to be restriction on dose. Like we have the maximum dose that you cannot take this drug more than this much. At least that type of restriction you can put.
And what about oocyte sharing? Initially, in the 2010, there was a mention that if you can give 7 oocytes for each person. You can do oocyte
I'm
sharing.
coming to that. I'm coming to that. That provision also I'm coming. We are discussing provisions now. What about anonymity of the donor? There is no mention about anonymity in this particular act. And why it is so? Why it is so? What we were worried about in anonymity, because they will have the right of inheritance if the person is known. And if he can prove that the genetic material is matching with this person, then he has a right of inheritance. Now, what they have changed is by putting this, section 31, the child born through ART technology shall be deemed to a biological child of the couple, and a donor shall relinquish all the parental rights over the child or children which may be born from his or her gamete. That means that part has been over. So you can take a non-donor now. That is what they promote, or that is what is their intention is. So if the problem of not getting the donor is solved, you tell patient that you get the donor from your family. That is what I think they are thinking. This can be only purpose, or they have oversighted the word anonymity. There can be 2 possibilities in the minds of the lawmaker. So, do you think the donor, the relative as a donor, will lead to some kind of consanguinity and all? Will there be some kind of that kind of problem?
I think it will be I mean, from the cases that we have seen, from the requests we have seen as from the related donor coming within the family to who wants some egg or embryo or sperm or anything, it will be a thorough confusion and some time later, and we'll only be doing all these sort of whatever in our consultation room, creating ruckus. I think anonymity of the donor will work the best in our sort of situation, in our I think that's my thing, because we have had couples who say, take my brother's sperm and put it with my brother's wife's oocyte, and then with the same whatever is the embryos, you please share it to both the ladies. I mean, these sort of requests we've had, and I mean, if the law allows, we are okay to do it, but I think it will create a lot of confusions.
Yes, and even in the family, there was a case which I always mention. There was a case when a lady had IUI done with the brother-in-law semen, and after 10 years, when the child was born, after 10 years, when there was dispute for property between two brothers, she said that my brother-in-law raped me, and the child was having the matching DNA with the brother-in-law. This type of problems can occur if the anonymity is not maintained. So this is not a good step, and we have to suggest that anonymity should be there in the bill. That word should be there. Now, a bank shall not supply the or oocyte of a single donor to more than one commissioning couple. Madhuri madam, this is what you were talking about. And they've said now you can give single oocyte or sperm, single sample for single couple. That's it. You cannot share it the way it was allowed in 2010. So this is also, and what is your opinion on this, sir?
Yeah, see, when you just try to use an optimum stimulation as per the regulation of taking only about 7 oocytes, the question of sharing does not come.
Yeah, and that is what they are looking at. The donor should not be overstimulated. They are looking into the benefit of the donors.
Now, in that case, you can always put it up saying that optimal stimulation to avoid OHS should be applied.
Yes, but in that case, if OHS will happen, it will be infringement of the law and you will be behind bar for 5 years. So better don't use such words. We have to use the word which we can maintain. If we say we will not give more than 300 micrograms, we can maintain that. But you cannot control OHSs. So only put words which we can control. Do not put any word which we cannot control in the law. So this is what they have said that.
No. So in this, I just wanted to ask you, suppose a couple has conceived with one sperm donor, and then they come in for a next conception. So there's no guarantee that they will have the same donor donating, no?
No. You have to keep the embryos for them. They can use those embryos again.
No, but when you're doing an IUI, there's no need of an embryo, no?
Yes. So in IUI, you can use different samples, but only one donor for one commissioning couple. That is what they have suggested. If it is not conducive to our practice, then we should suggest that there has to be some change in this. Right. So, Priya, what is your opinion on this? Should it be allowed or it should not be allowed, sharing?
Difficult. For example, like, I mean, a single donor in terms of oocyte for a patient is quite, we can say for one stimulation, at least we can try that and then do it. But then to have the same sperm for if they are having 3, like say they failed 2 IVF, you're going for every time you're using a donor sperm, it will be difficult to just find the same donor for all the things. So I think it is going to be practically impractical to find the same donor sample for 3 stimulations or 3 IUIs or whichever.
There is no question of 3 because the person can donate only once and you can supply that to only once, to only one couple. You don't have to find that person only. You have to forget that person.
Yes.
Unless you have frozen their embryos. That's it. You can use the same embryos, same set of embryos. So this is what is the provision, and if sharing, if it can cut down the cost to some extent, that point can be taken by the government if it comes to affect the cost of the treatment to the patient. If it is affecting your practice, you are not going to get the donor, it is none of their concern. If doctor gets harassed, no issues. If patient gets harassed, public gets harassed, public is having some problem, they will listen to it at least. So we have to put it in such a way that it will cut down the cost of the treatment to the patient, and the poor patient of the India will be able to take the treatment. If this is the provision, then they will listen. So we have to draft it that way.
I'm sorry to interrupt, sir. We have 5 more minutes.
Okay. All unused oocytes shall be preserved by the bank for use of the same recipient. Even the unused oocytes, you cannot give it to any other couple. Now we are coming to punishment. This is the last part. They've said any gynecologist, geneticist, RMP, or any person shall not abandon the child born through ART, shall sell human embryo or gamete, import human embryo, exploit the commissioning couple, sell any human embryo or gamete for research, or any intermediates to obtain gamete donors or purchase gamete donors. That is the no for all these things. At present, we are using intermediates to get the donors and to purchase the gametes. But that is not allowed in the even cell of human embryo. You cannot exploit commissioning couple. Now, this word you remember, exploit. There is no meaning. Patient can say that I got exploited. They have charged me so much and not given the result. I got exploited. This is what the exploit means. And what is the punishment? Whoever contravenes the provision A to G, which I showed you, shall be punishable with a fine not less than 5 lakhs, but may extend to 10 lakhs on the first contravention. So if you exploit and if you use the other agent, then it is double offense. And for second offense, the punishment of imprisonment of a term not less than 8 years, but may extend to 12 years. So 8 to 12 years, you will be in jail. This is what the law says. And for the second offense, 10 lakh rupees and may extend to 20 lakh rupees fine. So this is what is the provision. And also, they said whoever contravenes any of the provision of this act and rule. So our filling of forms, the consent, signature will fall into that, into rule, for which no penalty has been provided, shall be punishable as per subsection 2. That means if you do not take signature twice, it is double offense. You will pay 5 lakh rupees fine and you will go in jail for 8 years. This is what is the provision of penalty. Now, you want to say anything about this, or you are fine with this?
No, I think it is not fair. Definitely, it does not think it. For lack of just getting one signature, we cannot pay 5 lakhs and go to jail for 8 years.
Sir, what people have suggested to the parliament is you reduce it from 5 lakh to 1 lakh. That is what our associations have represented in the parliament.
See, what has happened to the PNDT Act? You have just enacted with so much of the punishment. Were you able to contain it?
Exactly. So here and word used for this is any contravention. Whoever contravenes any of the provision. Any provision means what? Not taking signature is a contravention. Not writing date is a contravention. And this will attract the punishment just like PNDT and more severe, 3 times more severe than PNDT. So we have to oppose this. In criminal law, when the imprisonment is the punishment, the law is very much codified. They have said when you do this act, then only the punishment is attracted. Here the punishment is attracted on any contravention. So this is very much unfair for the doctors, and we have to oppose this word. In no criminal law, these words are mentioned. Even in MTP Act, they have said the very clear mention that if the place is not registered, punishment is 5 years. If this is not there, punishment is this many years. They have given clear-cut idea that what is the contravention and what is the punishment. But here they have used the word any, and that will put all of us into the gamut of all the kinds of punishment they want to give it on to us. And that will open up one more door for bribery and the bossism and bureaucracy. So we have to fight this at the inception, at the very start of this. I think we should be on road like farmers for this particular provision, but we are not. We are always late wakers. We will wake up when somebody will be in jail. Then only we will wake up. Right? Just 4 days back, 4 or 5 days back, I was in a court for releasing one girl under POXCO Act. She forgot to. The girl said 20 years. She did termination, and then she said her age was 16.5 or so. And the police came and arrested that doctor. She was in jail for 1 day. This type of things will come if you are not awake and not aware about the provisions. All the offense under this act, the best part is all the offenses under this act shall be cognizable and bailable. In PNDT, it is not bailable. In POXO Act, it is not bailable. This is bailable and cognizable. So at least you will get the bail. That is what is the good part of the entire thing. Now, documentation error that will lead to punishment. Some couple, suppose they portray that they are married, but actually unmarried. Now you are given treatment. The law says you have to give treatment only to married couple. And you are giving treatment to them. It is contravention of that particular section. The punishment is 5 lakh rupees fine. So whose responsibility? There should be some word that if clinic gives treatment to such couple and they got donation or something, the doctor shall not be punished. If they have given wrong information, there should be presumption of ignorance in such cases as far as the doctor is concerned. Relatives giving donation for the couple, is it allowed? Because as per this we can, but should we have to think it should be or it should not be. Import of embryos, they have said you can't import the embryos. Now what about the NRI couple and foreign couple? We are promoting the tourism. If they want to bring their embryos here, what will happen? You can't import embryos as per this regulation. While the customs have come out with one circular on 20th June 2020 that embryos can be imported or exported with the NOC certificate from ICMR. It was prohibited up till now, but they have opened up the import and export of the embryo. And we are again restricting it by putting this act into place. So how far this is valid and logical in the wake of this medical tourism?
Law still says
so. Pardon? So, sir, it should be allowed or not? Embryo import export. If couple wants to take treatment here, is it okay or it is not good? Yes, madam.
I think it should be allowed. So in certain instances, we can define the incidences. Like, for instance, one of my patients, she has had one pregnancy and she's got plenty of embryos frozen here and they're living in the Gulf, and for many reasons, political or otherwise, they can't come back here. And they want the embryos, which are very good quality, to be sent to them in the Gulf. Now I have to say, no, we can't do it.
So I think embryo is a child of -9 months age. That's it. As the parent can carry the child anywhere, they should be allowed to carry the embryos.
Carry their embryos. You can say that, for the purposes of I think that came because of the surrogacy issue, because they were getting embryos from outside.
But embryos, so that surrogacy bill is a different bill. We have not discussed that part here.
If that is not going to be done, I don't think we need to object.
So as Einstein has said, the human spirit must prevail over the technology, whatever you do. And that is what we have to keep in our practice. So thank you very much. A big round of applause for all my panelists for a very good discussion. And I hope I have given some insight on the important points on the ART bill. And you all should suggest through your association, through at your personal capacity to the parliamentarian that you want this kind of change in the bill. I have gone through the bill. There are no major changes you require, but at least you require these points to be highlighted to them so that a better bill and better act will come out, and that will regulate us. So we also should decide, how do we want to get regulated? We have already decided we want to get regulated, but how do we want to get regulated? That also we should decide and not them. So thank you for patient hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bharat. Thank you.
For a wonderful and thought-provoking session. I thank all the faculties for sharing their perspectives. If we do not have any questions, then we would move to the vote of thanks by Dr. Reshmi. Kishore, are there any questions? Kishore Balaji? Okay, I think there are no questions. We would move on to the vote of thanks to be given by Dr. Reshmi, consultant at IRM.
You have to unmute, madam. You have to unmute.
Reshmi, you're still muted. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Hello, everyone. it's my privilege to deliver the vote of thanks on this occasion. On behalf of IRM, I would like to thank all the faculty members for sparing their time and for the thought-provoking session. I'm extremely to express my gratitude and thank even the delegates who have joined the CME program. I would like to thank Dr. Kundavi ma'am, the head of the department of IRM, for providing this opportunity to discuss the relevant issues which is required for our day-to-day practices. I would like to acknowledge our appreciation to Sinora, the Sun Pharma division, for supporting this session. And I would also like to thank the technical team behind this, the CEO, for arranging this, for providing their support. Special thanks to Balaji, Kishore, Meera, secretary, and Gopinath from marketing to arrange and make this session a success. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hitesh and all our faculty for the wonderful session.